Clean it properly, Richard Calloway said, his voice smooth but sharp enough to slice through the music. Or maybe this kind of place just isn't for you. The words didn't echo, they landed, heavy, deliberate, like a glass set down too hard on polished marble, and for a fraction of a second, the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a subtle tightening, like everyone inhaled at once and forgot to let it go. And Ava Johnson felt it before she even looked up, the weight of eyes, the pause in conversation, the quiet curiosity that always followed moments like this. Moments where someone like her became visible for the wrong reason. The red wine had spilled across the white linen tablecloth in a slow, bleeding stain, dripping over the edge, dark against the pale fabric, her hand still holding the damp cloth she'd been using to wipe the surface, her fingers steady even as her pulse ticked faster beneath her skin. The scent of citrus cleaner mixing with expensive cologne and aged oak from the bar behind her, everything too bright, too sharp. The chandelier light reflecting off crystal glasses and catching in the mirrored walls. That made the room feel twice as large and twice as exposed. She didn't answer him. Not right away, not because she didn't have something to say, but because she understood timing, understood that silence, when held long enough, could say more than words, and Richard noticed that, the slight tilt of his head, the faint crease forming between his brows as if her stillness itself was a disruption to the script he was used to. A script where people laughed, apologized, shrank. A few guests nearby exchanged glances, one woman lifting her champagne flute halfway before lowering it again, unsure whether to sip or simply watch, while a man in a tailored navy suit let out a small, uncomfortable chuckle that faded almost immediately when no one joined him. Ava finally looked up, her eyes calm, not defiant, not submissive, just present, as if she were seeing everything exactly as it was, nothing exaggerated, nothing softened, and for a second, that unsettled him more than any argument could have, because there was no reaction to push against, no emotion to dismiss, just clarity. She moved the cloth slowly across the table, pressing into the fabric, absorbing the spill with careful, practiced motions. The kind that came from doing this work long enough to know that rushing only made things worse. And as she did, her gaze flickered, just briefly, toward the stack of documents resting near his hand, their edges perfectly aligned, a fountain pen placed neatly on top, the contract that had been the center of the evening, the reason all these people had gathered in tailored suits and quiet ambition. And something in the way the pages had shifted when the wine hit the table caught her attention. A line of text partially exposed, a clause she hadn't meant to see but couldn't ignore now that she had. The words precise, legal, but wrong in a way that settled into her chest like a quiet alarm. Richard followed her glance without realizing it, his fingers brushing the edge of the paper, and the room, already tense, seemed to tighten just a little more. The music continuing somewhere in the background but distant now, like it belonged to another place entirely. And Ava felt the moment forming. That fragile space between staying invisible and stepping forward. The kind her mother had warned her about in quiet conversations late at night. The kind that could cost more than just a job. She finished wiping the table, straightened the cloth, and for a heartbeat, everything stilled. The light, the sound, the air itself. And then she spoke, her voice low, even, cutting clean through the silence without force. Sir, before you sign that, you might want to read page 14 again. No one moved at first, not because they did not hear her, but because they were not sure they were supposed to, the kind of hesitation that only existed in rooms where power usually spoke in one direction and never back. And Richard Calloway slowly turned his head toward her, not fully, just enough for his profile to catch the light, his expression unreadable but sharpened, as if her words had introduced something unexpected into a space that was carefully controlled. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, not warm, not amused, just practiced, the kind he used when someone said something he could easily dismiss. And he let out a soft breath through his nose, glancing briefly at the guests around him, as if inviting them to share in the moment. Page 14. He repeated, his tone light, but edged. That is very specific. And a few people shifted, one man adjusting his cufflinks, another leaning slightly closer to the table, as though proximity might reveal whether this was entertainment or disruption. Ava did not step back, did not lower her gaze. She simply stood there with the cloth still in her hand, damp against her fingers, her posture straight but not rigid, and that steadiness, that absence of apology, lingered longer than anyone expected, long enough that the room did not quite know how to move forward. Richard tapped the pen lightly against the top sheet. Once, twice, the sound small but amplified in the quiet, and then he gave a short, dismissive chuckle. "You read contracts now?" he asked, his eyes narrowing just slightly as they settled fully on her. And this time the laughter came, soft, scattered, uncertain but present, a release valve for tension that had nowhere else to go. While somewhere near the back a server paused mid-step, tray balanced. Carefully, watching without meaning to, Ava inhaled slowly, the air cool against her lungs, and when she spoke again her voice did not rise, did not push, it simply remained steady. "Not all of it, sir," she said. "Just enough to recognize when something does not match the rest." And that answer did not invite laughter. It redirected something, subtle but real, like a current shifting beneath still water. And one of the attorneys seated halfway down the table, a woman with thin-framed glasses, and a tablet resting against her palm, glanced down at the document, her fingers hesitating before she scrolled, her eyes moving quickly, scanning, then slowing. Richard noticed that. Of course he did. He noticed everything, and the faint smile faded just a fraction, replaced by a focus that was harder, more precise, and he leaned forward slightly, resting his hand on the contract as if to anchor it. "And what exactly," he said, his voice quieter now, less for the room and more for her, "does not match?" And the question hung there, heavier than before, because it was no longer rhetorical. Ava shifted her weight just enough to free one hand, the cloth lowering to her side, and she took a small step closer to the table, not enough to intrude, just enough to see clearly, the overhead light reflecting off the ink, the lines of text crisp and deliberate, and she pointed, not touching, just indicating, her finger hovering above the page. "That clause," she said. "The one about post-agreement liability. It is written like a standard protection, but the phrasing redirects all responsibility to your side after signing." And a quiet ripple moved through the table, not loud, not dramatic, just a series of exchanged glances, a subtle tightening of shoulders, the attorney's eyes flicking up briefly before returning to the screen, her lips pressing together as she read more carefully. Richard's fingers stilled on the paper, the pen no longer tapping. And for the first time since the spill, since the comment, since the room had shifted, there was no immediate response from him, just a pause, measured, deliberate, as if he were recalculating something that had seemed certain only moments ago, and the silence that followed was different now, not imposed, not performative, but real, the kind that formed when something unseen began to surface and no one yet knew what it would become. The attorney's hand stopped mid-scroll, her thumb hovering just above the glass screen as if the words beneath it had suddenly gained weight, and she leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing not in confusion but in recognition, the kind that comes when something familiar appears in the wrong place. And she adjusted her glasses slightly before speaking, her voice controlled but no longer casual. "He is right to pause," she said, not looking at Ava but at the document. "This clause is structured unusually," and that single word, unusually, moved through the room like a quiet signal, subtle but undeniable, shifting the balance of attention away from the girl in the uniform and toward the paper everyone had assumed was already understood. Richard did not react immediately, but his posture changed, just slightly, his shoulders drawing back, his focus narrowing, and he pulled the contract closer, flipping the page with deliberate care, the soft sound of paper sliding against paper suddenly, louder than the music still playing somewhere overhead. And as he scanned the lines, the faint crease between his brows deepened, not dramatically, but enough that those closest to him noticed. Ava remained where she was, not stepping forward again, not retreating, her presence steady like a fixed point in a room that was beginning to shift around her, the damp cloth in her hand now forgotten, her attention no longer on the table but on the unfolding moment she had already set into motion. Across from Richard, a man in a charcoal suit leaned toward the attorney, whispering something under his breath, but she shook her head slightly, her eyes never leaving the screen as her fingers moved again, scrolling back, then forward, cross-checking, and the quiet confidence she had carried earlier in the evening was gone, replaced by something more careful, more measured. Richard's jaw tightened as he reached the section Ava had indicated, his finger tracing the line slowly, once, then again, as if reading it a second time might change what it meant, but it did not, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was focused, every person in the room now aware that something had shifted, something that could not be laughed off or dismissed with a quick remark. "Explain it," he said finally, his voice lower now, directed not at Ava alone, but at the space between them, and it was not a command in the way it had been before. It was a request shaped like one, and that difference did not go unnoticed. Ava took a small breath, not to steady herself but to gather the exact words, and when she spoke, she did not rush. "It looks like a standard protection clause," she said, her tone even. "But the phrasing changes the direction of responsibility after the agreement is signed. If anything goes wrong, legally or financially, it does not stay shared. It shifts entirely to your side." And as she spoke, the attorney nodded once, almost imperceptibly, confirming what she was seeing in real time, while the man beside her leaned back slightly, his earlier confidence replaced by a tightening around his eyes. Richard's grip on the edge of the paper loosened just enough to reveal a flicker of something beneath the surface. Not panic, not yet, but awareness, the kind that arrives just before realization fully sets in. And he glanced up, not at the room, not at the guests who were now completely silent, but directly at Ava, as if seeing her for the first time not as a disruption, not as a mistake, but as a variable he had not accounted for. And in that moment, the space between them was no longer defined by status or role, but by something far more fragile, the possibility that she was right. Richard did not look away, not this time, not when the weight of her words settled fully into the space between them, and for a moment, the room seemed to narrow, not physically but perceptually, as if everything unnecessary had fallen out of focus, leaving only the contract, the table, and the quiet presence of a girl no one had noticed 10 minutes ago. He turned the page back, slower now, more deliberate, his finger tracing the clause again, then moving upward, comparing it to the earlier sections, the ones written in language that felt balanced, mutual, expected, and then back down again, where the wording shifted just enough to pass unnoticed unless someone was looking for it, unless someone knew what it meant to hide something important in plain sight. Across the table, the attorney exhaled softly, not a sigh, but something close, her posture changing as she set her tablet down and leaned forward, her voice careful but firm. "It is not standard," she said. "The structure is technically valid, but the implication is exactly as she described." And that confirmation did not raise the volume of the room. It lowered it further, pressing everything into a deeper kind of silence, the kind that did not need to be enforced because no one dared interrupt it. Richard's hand lifted from the paper, hovering for a second before resting flat against the table. His fingers spread slightly as if grounding himself in something solid. And when he spoke again, the tone had changed. Not dramatically, but enough that the edge was gone, replaced by something more controlled, more inward. "Who drafted this version?" he asked, his eyes shifting briefly toward the far end of the table where a man in a light gray suit sat stiffly, his earlier confidence now replaced by a careful stillness. The man cleared his throat, adjusting his tie with a small, precise motion. "It came from their legal team," he said, his voice steady but thinner than before. "We reviewed it, of course. Everything checked out." And the words sounded rehearsed, not false exactly, but incomplete, like something important had been assumed rather than confirmed. Ava listened without moving, her gaze returning briefly to the page, then lifting again, not to challenge, not to interrupt, but simply to remain present in the space she had already altered. And that presence, quiet and unwavering, made it harder for anyone to pretend this was still a minor detail. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, the leather creasing softly beneath him, and for the first time since the evening began, he did not look like a man in control of every variable. He looked like someone recalculating, measuring risk against certainty, and finding the equation no longer balanced. His eyes moved once more to Ava, studying her not with dismissal, but with intent. as if trying to understand how she had seen what others had missed, and there was no immediate answer to that. No simple explanation that fit neatly into the hierarchy of the room. "How did you catch it?" he asked, the question direct, unguarded in a way that shifted the dynamic yet again, and a few heads turned, not because they expected her to answer, but because they wanted to hear how she would. Ava did not hesitate, but she did not rush either, her voice steady, grounded, "Because it does. Not read like protection," she said. "It reads like a transfer." And that distinction, simple but precise, landed with more force than any long explanation could have, and the attorney nodded again, slower this time, as if sealing the conclusion. The man in the gray suit shifted in his chair, his hand moving toward his glass but stopping short, the room no longer offering the comfort it had earlier, and somewhere in the background, the music continued, soft and distant, a reminder that the evening had been designed for celebration, not for this, not for a moment where everything paused because someone who was not supposed to speak had said exactly the right thing. The question lingered in the air for a moment longer than expected, not because it was difficult, but because it carried weight now, the kind that made every word matter, and Ava felt that shift, not as pressure, but as clarity, the kind that comes when a moment becomes irreversible. She glanced down briefly at the edge of the table, at the faint outline of where the wine stain had been, now only a damp shadow against the linen, and then she looked back up, her voice calm, almost quiet, but precise enough to hold the entire room. "Because I have seen it before," she said, and the simplicity of that answer did not close the question, it opened it. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, as if he were adjusting his understanding in real time, and he leaned forward just enough to rest his forearms on the table, his attention no longer divided between people and presentation, but fixed entirely on her. "Where?" he asked, and there was no mockery in it now, no dismissal, only intent. Ava took a small breath, not to steady herself, but to choose the right words, and when she spoke again, there was a softness beneath the clarity, something personal but controlled. "My father signed something like this," she said. "Different company, different numbers, but the structure was the same. Everything looked balanced until it was not, and when things went wrong, all of it came back to him." And the room did not react with sound. It reacted with stillness, a deeper kind, one that carried understanding rather than curiosity. The attorney lowered her gaze for a second, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her tablet, as if the story filled in a gap the document alone could not, while the man in the gray suit shifted again, this time more noticeably, his posture tightening, as if the narrative itself made the clause harder to defend. Richard's expression did not change dramatically, but something in it softened at the edges, not sympathy exactly, but recognition. The kind that comes when a situation moves from abstract risk to something lived, something real, and he looked back down at the contract, then up again, the movement slower now, more deliberate. "And you recognized it from one line," he said, not as a challenge, but as a statement he was testing, and Ava nodded once, her gaze steady. "From the way it was written," she replied. "When something is meant to protect both sides, it reads evenly. This one leans just enough that you would not notice unless you were looking for where the weight falls." And the phrasing settled into the room. With a quiet finality, the kind that did not need to be repeated to be understood, Richard leaned back again, his chair giving a soft, almost inaudible sound, and for a moment he said nothing, his hand resting near the pen but not reaching for it, his eyes no longer scanning the page but considering something beyond it and around him. The room remained still, not because it was waiting for permission to move, but because no one wanted to break the moment that had formed. Finally, he exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, measured, and he turned his head slightly toward the man in the gray suit. "We are not signing anything tonight," he said, his voice calm but absolute. And that single sentence shifted the entire room, not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively, like a line drawn where none had existed before. The man in gray opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, the argument dissolving before it could form, while the attorney gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, confirming the decision without needing to speak. Richard's gaze returned to Ava, and for a brief moment, The room disappeared again, leaving only the space between them, and he studied her, not as a server, not as an interruption, but as someone who had changed the outcome of something significant without raising her voice. And when he spoke again, the words were quieter, but carried more weight than anything he had said earlier. "You just saved us from a very expensive mistake," he said, and Ava did not smile, did not step forward. She simply held his gaze for a second, then lowered her eyes back to the table, lifting the cloth once more to finish wiping the last trace of the spill, as if the moment, for her, had never been about anything more than doing what was right. The room did not return to normal, not immediately, because something invisible had shifted and no one seemed certain how to move around it. Conversations that had once flowed easily now hesitated at the edges, voices lowered, laughter absent, and the soft clink of glass against glass sounded almost out of place, like a memory from a different version of the evening. Ava finished wiping the last trace of moisture from the table, folding the cloth neatly in her hand, her movements steady and unhurried, as if the weight of what had just happened had not altered her rhythm at all, and that, more than anything, drew quiet attention from those nearby. The way she returned to her role without seeking acknowledgement, without waiting for approval. Richard remained seated, the contract still open in front of him, but no longer the center of his focus, his gaze drifting for a moment to the chandelier above, the light refracting into sharp fragments across the polished surfaces, then back down again, his expression thoughtful in a way that did not match the confident certainty he had carried earlier. And when he finally moved, it was not abrupt, not commanding, but deliberate, his hand sliding the document slightly away as if creating space between himself and what it represented. "What is your name?" he asked, the question simple, but placed carefully into the quiet, and a few heads turned again, not because they expected her to answer differently, but because the question itself marked a change in direction. Ava paused just long enough to acknowledge it, her eyes lifting from the table to meet his again. "Ava Johnson," she said, her voice even, and there was no hesitation in it, no adjustment to tone or posture, just clarity. And the name seemed to settle into the room like something that should have been known earlier, but was only now being heard. Richard nodded once, repeating it quietly under his breath as if anchoring it. "Ava." And then he leaned back slightly, studying her with a focus that was no longer about status or interruption, but about understanding, about recalibration, and for a brief moment, the distance between them felt different, not erased, but altered in a way that no one in the room could ignore. At the far end of the table, the man in the gray suit shifted again, clearing his throat as if attempting to restore the flow of the evening. "We can have our team revise the clause," he offered, his voice controlled but carrying a trace of urgency now. "This does not have to delay anything." But the suggestion did not land the way it might have earlier. It did not carry the same authority, and Richard did not respond right away, his attention still on Ava, as if weighing something that extended beyond the contract itself. "No," he said finally, his voice calm, but firm enough to close the door on that line of thinking. "We will review everything again, from the beginning." And the finality of it settled over the table, not loud, not forceful, but absolute, leaving no room for negotiation. The attorney gave a slight nod of agreement, already gathering her notes with a renewed focus, while the man in gray leaned back, his hands folding together in front of him as if accepting a decision he could no longer influence. Ava stepped back then, just one step, enough to return to the space she had occupied before, the invisible line that separated her from the center of the room. But the line did not feel the same anymore, not to anyone watching, because once crossed, even quietly, it could not be fully restored. She turned slightly, preparing to move to the next table, the next task, the continuation of a job that had not changed in title, even if everything else had shifted around it. And as she did, Richard spoke again, not louder, not to stop her, but enough that she heard him clearly. "Ava," he said, and she paused, just briefly, not turning fully, just enough to acknowledge the call, and for a moment he did not continue, as if choosing the next words mattered more than saying anything at all. And in that pause, the room held its breath once more, waiting to see what would follow. She stopped, not fully turning, just enough that her shoulder shifted and her gaze moved slightly back toward him. The kind of pause that acknowledged without surrendering the quiet boundary she had stepped back into. And Richard noticed that, the precision of it, the way she remained composed even now, even after the room had shifted in her direction. He held her there for a second with nothing but silence, not out of hesitation, but because the words he was about to say did not come as easily as the ones he had used before, the sharp ones, the dismissive ones. Those had always been effortless, but this required something else, something less practiced. "You saw what none of us did," he said finally, his voice steady but lower than before, not meant for the entire room, just for her, and maybe for himself, and the statement carried a weight that did not need emphasis, because everyone had already felt it. Ava did not step closer, did not fill the space. She simply stood where she was, her hand resting lightly at her side with the folded cloth, her posture relaxed but grounded, and when she answered, her voice remained calm. "You were not looking for it," she said, and the words were not an accusation, not even a correction, just a truth placed gently into the air. A few people shifted at that, not because it was offensive, but because it was precise, the kind of clarity that made people aware of their own assumptions, and the attorney lowered her eyes briefly, as if replaying the earlier review in her mind, searching for the moment where she had skimmed instead of examined. Richard's expression tightened for a fraction of a second, not in defense, but in recognition, and he nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if accepting something he could not argue with, and then he leaned forward slightly, resting his hand on the edge of the table again. But this time the gesture did not feel like control, it felt like grounding. "Still," he said, his tone measured. "You chose to speak. And that was not a small thing in a room like this, not in a space where roles were clearly defined and rarely crossed." And Ava understood that, not as praise, but as context, and she answered without hesitation. "Because it would have cost you more if I did not," she said. And again, there was no emotion layered onto it, no attempt to soften or sharpen the statement, just fact. The man in the gray suit let out a slow breath, almost inaudible, his gaze dropping to the table as if the conversation itself had moved beyond him, while the attorney finally straightened, her shoulders settling into a new posture, one that acknowledged the shift in authority that had quietly taken place. Richard glanced briefly at the contract, then back at Ava, and for a moment, the distance between their positions felt less defined, not erased, but altered in a way that could not be reversed by simply returning to routine. "Where did you learn to read them like that?" he asked, and this time the question carried something else, not just curiosity, but respect, still forming, still unfamiliar, but present. Ava paused for the first time, not because she did not have an answer, but because the answer was not simple, and her gaze drifted for a second toward the far wall, where the mirrored surface reflected the room in fragments, multiple versions of the same moment layered together, and then she looked back at him. "From watching someone lose everything because no one noticed," she said, and the words settled heavier than anything before them, because they carried history, not theory, and the room felt it, not loudly, but deeply. Richard held her gaze for a second longer, and then he nodded again, slower this time, as if the understanding had reached a different level, and when he finally leaned back, the shift in him was clear, not dramatic, not visible in any single gesture, but present in the way he no longer occupied the room in the same way as before, and Ava, without waiting for anything more, turned slightly and continued toward the next table, her steps quiet against the polished floor, her role unchanged in title, but no longer invisible in the way it had been at the start of the night. The distance between tables felt longer than it had earlier, not because the room had changed, but because the awareness within it had. Every step Ava took now carried a quiet recognition she had not asked for, not from all, but from enough to shift the atmosphere, and she moved the same way she always had, measured, efficient, her attention returning to the details that grounded her, the placement of glasses, the alignment of silverware, the faint ring of condensation left behind by a half-finished drink. Behind her, the conversation at the main table did not resume in the way it had before. It reformed, slower, more careful, voices lowered not out of secrecy, but out of recalibration, and Richard remained seated for a moment longer than expected, his gaze no longer fixed on the contract, but drifting across the room, following her path without making it obvious, as if trying to understand something that could not be reduced to a single explanation. The attorney leaned in again, her voice quiet but precise, outlining what needed to be reviewed, the sections that required re-examination, the implications that had been overlooked, and Richard listened, but not with the same automatic certainty as before. There was a pause between her words and his response now, a space where consideration lived, and when he nodded, it was not to confirm what he already believed, but to accept what he was still processing. At the next table, Ava adjusted a place setting by a fraction of an inch, aligning the fork with the edge of the plate, the movement small but exact, and one of the guests, a woman in a deep green dress, watched her for a moment before speaking softly. "That was impressive," she said, not loudly, not to draw attention, just enough to be heard, and Ava glanced up briefly, offering a polite nod, not a smile meant to engage, but one that acknowledged the comment without expanding it. "Thank you," she said, her tone even, and then her focus returned to the table, because for her, the moment had already passed. Across the room, Richard finally stood, the chair sliding back with a soft sound against the floor, and the subtle shift drew attention again, not because it was dramatic, but because everything he did carried weight in a space like this, and he buttoned his jacket with a slow, deliberate motion, his posture straight but no longer rigid, as if something within it had loosened, not weakened, but adjusted. He walked a few steps away from the table, not toward the center of the room, but slightly off to the side, creating space between himself and the contract. And from there, his perspective changed, the room no longer arranged around a single focal point, but spread out in layers, people, movement, reflection, and in that wider view, Ava was no longer just a presence at his table. She was part of the room in a way that had not been visible to him before. The man in the gray suit remained seated, his hands clasped together, his gaze fixed downward as if the surface of the table could offer some kind of stability, while the attorney continued, reviewing her notes, already shifting into a different mode of thinking, one that required precision rather than assumption. Richard's attention returned to Ava once more, not because she was doing anything remarkable now, but because she was not, because she had returned to something ordinary after altering something significant, and that contrast stayed with him longer than the moment itself. The music, still playing softly in the background, began to feel more present again, not because it had grown louder, but because the silence had eased just enough to let it back in, and conversations resumed, cautious at first, then gradually more fluid. Though never quite the same as before, Ava moved to the next setting, adjusting a glass by a fraction, her reflection briefly catching in its surface, distorted but recognizable, and then gone as she stepped away, leaving everything in order, as if nothing had happened, even though everyone in the room knew that something had, something quiet but irreversible, something that could not be undone by simply continuing the evening as planned. Near the back of the room, where the lighting softened and the reflections from the glass walls blurred into something less precise, Ava paused for a brief second beside a service station, setting the folded cloth down next to a tray of polished silverware, her fingers resting lightly against the cool metal as if anchoring herself in something familiar. And for the first time since she had spoken, her breath slowed just enough to feel it, steady, controlled, not shaken but aware, the kind of awareness that lingers after a moment that cannot be taken back. Around her, the quiet hum of the event resumed in fragments, low conversations weaving in and out, the subtle clink of glasses returning, but underneath it all there was a different tone now, less certain, more attentive, as if the room itself had learned something it could not unlearn. Across the space, Richard remained standing, his attention divided between the people speaking to him and the thoughts he had not yet voiced, and when a man approached with a polite smile and a question about rescheduling the signing, Richard responded with a nod, but his answer came a second slower than expected, as if part of him was still elsewhere, still replaying the moment when a single sentence had shifted everything. The attorney stood beside him, her tablet now filled with annotations, her posture more engaged than before, no longer operating on assumption but on verification, and as she outlined the next steps, her tone carried A precision that had not been present earlier, each word measured, each implication considered. While the man in the gray suit listened with a tight expression, his earlier confidence replaced by a careful neutrality that did not quite hide the tension beneath it. Ava picked up a fresh glass from the tray, holding it briefly up to the light, checking for any trace of imperfection, and the surface reflected a fragment of the room, distorted but recognizable. A chandelier stretched across the curve, figures moving in softened outlines, and for a moment, she saw herself there too, not clearly, but enough to register, enough to remind her that she was still part of this space, even if she did not belong to its center. A voice behind her broke the quiet of her thoughts, soft but direct. "You should be careful," a fellow server said, her tone low enough to stay between them, and Ava turned slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge her, the concern in the woman's eyes not judgmental, but cautious, shaped by experience, by an understanding of how moments like this could unfold in ways that were not always visible at first. Ava nodded once, not dismissing the warning, but not absorbing it as fear either. "I am," she said, her voice calm, and then she set the glass back onto the tray, aligning it with the others, because precision was something she could control, something that did not shift depending on who was watching. Across the room, Richard's conversation paused, not because he had been interrupted, but because he had chosen to stop speaking, his gaze lifting again, scanning the space until it settled, once more, on Ava, and this time there was no attempt to hide it, no subtlety in the way he observed her, as if he had accepted that whatever he was trying to understand required direct attention, not distance. He took a step forward, then another, not toward the center of the room, but along its edge, moving through the space in a way that was quieter than before, less about presence, more about purpose, and as he walked, the people he passed adjusted slightly, not out of obligation, but out of instinct, the kind that follows someone used to leading. Ava did not look up immediately, her focus still on the tray, on the alignment of the glasses, on the small, controlled tasks that grounded her, but she felt the shift before she saw it. The subtle change in the air that came when someone approached with intention rather than coincidence. And when she finally lifted her gaze, Richard was already there, not too close, not imposing, just present. And for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the space between them quiet but not empty, holding the weight of what had already passed and the possibility of what had not yet been said. Richard did not speak right away, not because he did not have something to say, but because the moment did not feel like one that should be rushed, and for perhaps the first time that evening, he allowed the silence to exist without trying to control it, his gaze steady on Ava, not demanding, not dismissive, just present in a way that was unfamiliar to him, and she met that presence without stepping back, her posture relaxed but grounded, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the service tray, the polished glasses reflecting fragments of both of them in distorted curves. "You could have said nothing," he said finally, his voice quieter than it had been at any point before, not carrying across the room, not intended for anyone else, and the statement hung between them not as a question, but as an observation that had taken time to form. Ava glanced briefly at the reflection in one of the glasses, her own image bending along the surface, then back at him. "I could have," she replied, her tone even, and there was no hesitation in it. No attempt to justify or explain beyond what was already understood. Richard nodded once, slow, as if confirming something internally, and then he shifted his weight slightly, his hands coming together loosely in front of him, a posture that did not match the authority he had carried earlier, but something more measured, more deliberate. "Most people would have," he added, and this time there was something beneath the words, not approval exactly, but recognition of a choice that had not been obvious or easy. Ava remained still, her expression unchanged, not dismissing what he was told, she said, her gaze holding his, and no one corrected it. And that was all. No elaboration, no detail, just a truth that did not need expansion to be understood. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in tension, but in thought, and he looked down briefly at the floor, the polished surface reflecting the overhead light in clean, sharp lines, before lifting his eyes again. "And you decided not to let that happen again," he said, more to himself than to her. and Ava did not respond this time, because the statement did not require it. It simply existed, accurate and complete. A server passed behind them, the soft movement of fabric and the faint clink of glass marking the return of routine, and yet the space around them remained distinct, separate from the rest of the room, defined by a conversation that did not follow the usual patterns of hierarchy or expectation. Richard straightened slightly, the subtle shift bringing a hint of his earlier composure back, but not entirely, not in the same way. And when he spoke again, the words were chosen, not automatic. "You should not be doing this job," he said, not as an insult, not as dismissal, but as a statement of misplaced alignment, and Ava's expression did not change, but there was a faint pause before she answered, just enough to acknowledge the weight of it. "It is the job that pays right now," she said, her tone steady, grounded in reality rather than possibility. Richard held her gaze for a second, longer, as if considering that answer from multiple angles, and then he gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in understanding, and the silence that followed was different from the ones before, not tense, not uncertain, but open, as if something had shifted not just in the room, but in the direction of what might come next. Richard did not move away, even after the conversation reached a natural pause, as if leaving too quickly would return everything to what it had been before, and for a man accustomed to controlling outcomes, that felt like something he was no longer willing to do. The room behind them continued its careful recovery, voices regaining shape, small laughter returning in cautious fragments. But it all felt distant compared to the quiet space they occupied, a space that had shifted from hierarchy to something less defined, something more human. He glanced briefly at the service tray beside her, at the rows of identical glasses aligned with quiet precision, each one reflecting light in slightly different angles, and then back at her, his expression thoughtful, recalibrated. "What are you planning to do next?" he asked, the question simple on the surface, but carrying more weight than it appeared, because it was not about the next table or the next task. It was about direction, about possibility. Ava's eyes moved to the tray for a moment, her fingers lightly adjusting the position of one glass by a fraction of an inch, aligning it with the others before answering, not out of avoidance, but because she chose her words with the same care she applied to everything else. "Finish my shift," she said, and there was no sarcasm in it, no attempt to deflect, just a grounded answer rooted in reality. And that steadiness, that refusal to step into something hypothetical, made the moment feel more real, not less. Richard let out a small breath, almost a quiet acknowledgement, and nodded once, as if accepting that answer on its own terms rather than pushing it further, and for a second, he looked like a man standing at the edge of a decision he had not expected to face tonight. Behind him, the attorney approached slightly, her voice low but clear enough to reach him. "We will need to go through the entire agreement again," she said, her tone precise. "There may be more embedded language we did not catch," and Richard turned his head just enough to acknowledge her, his focus splitting briefly between responsibility and the moment in front of him. "Do it," he replied, his voice steady, but without the impatience that had defined him earlier, line by line. And she nodded, already moving back toward the table, her posture reflecting a renewed seriousness that had not been there before. When he looked back at Ava, something had settled in his expression, not fully formed, but clearer than before, and he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, the motion unhurried, deliberate, pulling out a small, simple card, white with minimal text, the kind that did not need to prove anything because everything it represented was already known. He held it for a moment, as if considering whether to follow through, and then extended it toward her, not forcing it into her space, just offering it within reach. "If you ever decide you want something different," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "call this number." And the words were not framed as an opportunity or a favor. They were presented as a door, one that existed whether she chose to open it or not. Ava looked at the card, not immediately reaching for it, her gaze steady, measuring, not the value of what it represented, but the intention behind it. And for a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow again, not with tension, but with focus, as if everything else had faded just enough to leave only the decision in front of her. She lifted her hand slowly, taking the card without hesitation but without urgency, her fingers closing around it lightly, and she glanced at it for a second, just enough to register what it was, before looking back up at him. "Thank you," she said, her tone even, not grateful in excess, not distant, just acknowledging. And that balance, that refusal to be overwhelmed or dismissive, held its own kind of weight. Richard gave a small nod in return, not expecting more, not asking for anything in that moment. And for a second, neither of them moved, the space between them quiet but complete, holding everything that had passed and everything that had not yet been decided. And then Ava lowered her hand, slipping the card into the pocket of her uniform, not as a declaration, not as a promise, just as a possibility. And with that, she turned slightly, returning her attention to the tray, to the glasses, to the quiet rhythm of her work, while behind her, Richard remained where he was for a moment longer, watching not the action itself, but the intention within it, as if understanding that what had happened tonight was not just a single moment, but the beginning of something he had not yet fully grasped. The card rested in the pocket of her uniform, light enough to forget, but present enough to feel, a small rectangle that did not change the weight of her shift, but altered something quieter beneath it. And Ava moved through the room with the same measured rhythm as before, collecting empty glasses, replacing folded napkins, her attention anchored in the details that required no permission, no interpretation, just precision. The event had resumed its surface, conversations rebuilding, laughter returning in careful layers, but beneath it all there remained a subtle awareness, a shift in how people looked, not openly, not in a way that called attention, but in brief glances, in pauses that lasted a second longer than necessary, in the way some guests now noticed her when she passed, not as a disruption, but as someone they had previously overlooked. Across the room, Richard had returned to the table, the contract now surrounded by notes, annotations filling the margins, the attorney speaking in low, focused tones as she outlined inconsistencies, her voice carrying a different kind of authority now, one shaped by caution rather than assumption. And Richard listened without interruption, his posture composed but no longer rigid, his attention sharper, more deliberate, as if every word required verification before acceptance. The man in the gray suit remained seated, quieter than before, his earlier ease replaced by a careful stillness, his gaze shifting between the document and the discussion, as if recalculating his position in real time. And for the first time that evening, he did not attempt to guide the conversation, he followed it. Ava paused briefly at the edge of the table, reaching to replace a glass that had been left half full, her movement smooth, unobtrusive. But Richard noticed, his eyes lifting for just a moment, not to interrupt, not to call attention, but simply to register her presence again. And there was no tension in that glance now, no imbalance, just acknowledgement. She moved on without waiting, stepping into the flow of the room, her focus returning to the next task, the next detail, the quiet sequence of actions that defined her role. And yet, the space she moved through no longer felt the same. Not because it had changed physically, but because the way it responded to her had, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough. Near the far wall, a group of guests spoke in low tones, their conversation drifting toward the earlier moment without naming it directly. Phrases like, "caught it just in time," and "that could have been serious," passing between them, not as gossip, but as recognition of something that had nearly gone unnoticed. And Ava heard none of it clearly. But she felt the shift in tone, the way the room carried a different kind of respect, not loud, not declared, but present. She adjusted a centerpiece, aligning it with the edge of the table, her fingers brushing lightly against the cool surface, and for a second, she paused, not because she needed to, but because something within her had settled, a quiet understanding that the moment she had stepped into had already done what it needed to do, whether or not anything came after. Across the room, Richard signed off on a temporary halt, his pen moving with controlled precision as he initialed the decision to delay, the motion small but significant. And when he set the pen down, he leaned back slightly, his gaze moving once more through the room, not searching this time, just observing. And when it reached Ava again, there was no question in it, no calculation, just a recognition that something had changed, not in the structure of the evening, but in the way he saw it. Ava picked up another tray, balancing it lightly in one hand, the weight familiar. manageable, and as she turned to move toward the next section of the room, the card remained in her pocket, untouched, not as a promise, not as a decision, but as a quiet possibility that did not demand attention, only time, and for now, that was enough. The evening did not end with an announcement or a clear turning point. It unfolded quietly, the way most real changes do, without spectacle, without a defined moment where everything shifted at once. And Ava continued her work until the rhythm of the room began to slow. Conversations thinning, chairs easing back, the low hum of voices softening into something more scattered and tired. The kind of sound that follows an event that has run its course. The chandeliers above still cast their steady light, but it felt warmer now, less sharp against the polished surfaces, as if the room itself had exhaled after holding tension for too long. Ava moved between the final tables, collecting the last of the glasses, her steps light but deliberate, each motion practiced, efficient, and when she reached the main table again, the contract was no longer spread across it, replaced instead by neatly stacked papers marked with notes. The decision already made, the outcome redirected, and Richard was no longer seated there, his absence noticeable not because it left a gap, but because it removed the center the room had once revolved around. She gathered the remaining items, aligning them on her tray, the faint clink of glass against glass the only sound that marked her presence, and as she turned, she caught a reflection of herself in the darkened surface of the window, the city lights outside stretching into soft lines beyond the glass, her figure framed between them, small but steady, unchanged in appearance, but not in the way she had moved through the night. Near the exit, a few guests lingered, their voices low, their expressions thoughtful, and as Ava passed, one of them paused, stepping slightly aside to give her space, not as a gesture of obligation, but as something quieter, a recognition that did not need to be spoken. She nodded once in return, a small acknowledgement, and continued on, her attention already shifting toward the next task, the next step, the continuation of a routine that did not depend on the moment that had passed. Outside the main hall, the corridor was cooler, the air carrying a faint scent of polished wood and distant city air, and the noise of the event faded behind her, replaced by a quieter kind of silence, one that did not press, but settled, and Ava paused for just a second near the service door, setting the tray down on a side table, her fingers brushing against the edge as if marking the end of something without naming it. She reached into her pocket then, not hurried, not uncertain, and pulled out the card, holding it between her fingers as she looked at it again. The simple design, the clean lettering, the number that represented a possibility rather than a promise. And for a moment, she did nothing, just stood there with it, the weight of it not in its size, but in what it implied. Behind her, the door to the hall opened briefly, a wave of sound spilling out before it closed again, reminding her that the evening was still ending, that time had not paused, and she slipped the card back into her pocket. Not rejecting it, not claiming it, just placing it where it had been, a choice deferred rather than decided. When she picked up the tray again and pushed the door open, stepping into the quieter space beyond, her movements were the same as they had been at the start of the night, steady, composed, grounded, but there was something different in the way she carried them now, something that did not announce itself, but remained, quiet and certain, like a line that had been crossed and could not be unseen. And as the door closed behind her, the light from the hall fading into a softer glow, the room she left behind continued on without her, but not unchanged, not entirely. Because sometimes it is not the loudest voice that shifts everything, but the one that speaks at exactly the right moment, and then returns to silence as if nothing needed to be proven at all. The hallway beyond the service door carried a different kind of quiet, not the heavy silence of tension, but the steady hum of work continuing behind the scenes, carts rolling softly over polished floors, distant voices exchanging brief instructions, the rhythm of a place that did not pause for moments that felt significant elsewhere, and Ava stepped into it without hesitation, her pace unchanged, her posture the same, as if the transition from one space to another required no adjustment at all. She set the tray down on a stainless steel counter, the metal cool beneath her fingers, the faint scent of detergent and warm air replacing the layered fragrances of the ballroom, and for a second, she stood still, not out of uncertainty, but because stillness, here, did not draw attention. It simply existed. Another worker passed behind her, nodding once in acknowledgement. A quiet exchange that required no words. And Ava returned it just as simply, because this was the part of the world where things remained clear, where roles were understood without explanation, where effort spoke louder than status. In the distance, a door opened and closed again, the sound soft but distinct, and footsteps followed, measured, deliberate, not hurried, not hesitant, and Ava did not turn immediately, not because she did not notice, but because she recognized the difference between movement that belonged to this space and movement that did not. The footsteps stopped a few feet behind her, and for a moment, there was only the quiet between them, the kind that did not demand to be filled. And then Richard's voice, lower now, without the weight it had carried earlier in the ballroom. "I was not finished," he said, not sharply, not as a correction, but as a continuation. Ava turned then, slowly, her expression steady, not surprised, not guarded, just present, and the distance between them felt different here, not defined by tables or guests or expectation, just two people standing in a space that did not belong to either of their worlds entirely. Richard glanced briefly around, taking in the simplicity of the environment, the clean lines, the absence of display, and then back at her, as if recalibrating once more, and when he spoke again, the words were more direct, less shaped by the room he had left behind. "You said you learned from watching someone lose everything," he said. "What would you have done differently if you had been in his place?" And the question did not come from authority. It came from curiosity, from a place that did not assume it already knew the answer. Ava considered it for a moment, not because she needed time, but because the question deserved precision, and she rested her hand lightly against the edge of the counter, grounding herself in something solid. "I would have asked more questions," she said, her voice calm. "And I would have read every line like it mattered, because it does." And there was no emphasis in the statement, no attempt to make it sound larger than it was, just truth delivered without decoration. Richard nodded slowly, absorbing it, his gaze shifting briefly downward, as if mapping her words onto something he recognized in his own experience. And when he looked back up, there was something quieter in his expression, something that did not align with the certainty he had carried earlier. "Most people do not get a second chance to catch it," he said, and Ava met his gaze without hesitation. "Then they should not ignore the first one," she replied, and the simplicity of that response settled between them, not as a challenge, but as a conclusion that did not require agreement to be valid. Richard exhaled softly, the sound almost lost in the ambient noise of the hallway, and for a moment, he did not respond, not because he disagreed, but because there was nothing to add that would improve the clarity of what had already been said, and that was something he was not used to. The distance between them remained, but it no longer felt like a barrier, just space, neutral, unclaimed. And after a few seconds, Ava reached for the tray again, lifting it with the same steady motion as before, her attention already shifting back to what needed to be done, because the conversation, for her, had reached its natural end. Richard watched that transition, the way she returned to her work without hesitation, without looking back, and for the first time that night, he did not try to extend the moment, did not interrupt the rhythm she had chosen. He simply nodded once, more to himself, then to her, and stepped back, allowing the space to settle into what it had been before he entered it, though not entirely the same, not anymore, because even in a place where everything was designed to function without disruption, something had changed, something quiet but lasting, something that would not announce itself, but would remain, shaping what came next in ways neither of them needed to name. The tray felt lighter than it should have, not because its weight had changed, but because something inside Ava had settled into place, something quiet and steady that did not need recognition to exist, and she moved down the hallway with the same measured pace, her steps soft against the polished floor, the distant sounds of the ballroom fading further behind her with each step until they became nothing more than a low hum, indistinct and distant, like a memory already beginning to blur at the edges. She pushed through the final door into the back area where the lighting was softer and the air carried the familiar scent of clean linen and warm metal, a space where everything was practical, grounded, unchanged by what had happened beyond it. and she set the tray down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the counter as she always did, her fingers adjusting it by a fraction of an inch until it was exactly where it needed to be. Around her, the quiet rhythm of closing continued, carts being rolled into place, glasses stacked, surfaces wiped down with practiced efficiency, and no one asked her what had happened. No one needed to. Because in this space, the work mattered more than the moment. And that was something she understood, something she relied on. She reached into her pocket again, her fingers brushing against the card, and this time she pulled it out without hesitation, holding it between her fingers as she looked at it once more, the clean lettering, the number, the simplicity of it all, and for a moment, she allowed herself to think about it, not as an escape, not as a promise, but as an option that existed because she had chosen to speak when it mattered, because she had not remained silent when silence would have been easier. The thought did not overwhelm her. It did not rush her into a decision. It simply settled there, quiet and present, and after a second, she slipped the card back into her pocket, not hiding it, not discarding it, just placing it where it belonged for now. A possibility waiting for the right time rather than demanding one. Behind her, the door opened again, and the faint echo of the ballroom returned for a brief second before fading as it closed, and she did not turn this time, because she did not need to, because whatever remained behind that door no longer required her attention. She picked up a clean cloth, running it slowly across the surface of the counter, the motion smooth, controlled, the faint scent of cleaning solution rising into the air, grounding her in the present, in the simple, tangible act of finishing what she had started. And as she moved, her reflection caught briefly in the stainless steel, clearer here than it had been in the curved glass of the ballroom, her features steady, her expression calm, unchanged in the ways that mattered. And she held that reflection for a second before letting it pass, not because she did not recognize it, but because she did not need to linger on it. Somewhere deeper in the building, a clock ticked softly, marking the passing of time in a way that felt more real than the music or the conversation that had filled the earlier hours, and Ava finished the last motion, folding the cloth neatly in her hand before setting it down, her work complete, her shift ending not with applause or acknowledgement, but with quiet finality, the kind that did not need to be witnessed, to be real. And as she turned to leave, stepping into the dimmer corridor beyond, the light from the room falling softly behind her, there was no dramatic change in her path, no sudden shift in direction, just the same steady movement forward, but now, carrying something different, something that did not show in her steps or her posture, but existed all the same, a quiet certainty that she had not needed to be powerful to change something important, that she had not needed to be seen to make an impact. And as the door closed gently behind her, the sound soft and final, the space she left behind continued as it always had, but not entirely the same. Because sometimes the smallest moment, spoken in a calm voice and followed by silence, is enough to remind everyone in the room what integrity actually looks like.